It was just another ordinary Tuesday afternoon in October, 1978, when everything changed for the Henderson family forever. The leaves were turning golden brown, and there was that crisp autumn smell in the air that made you want to rake up piles just to jump in them. 8-year-old Michael had been outside for about an hour, playing on his favorite swing set that his dad Robert had built for him the summer before. Margaret Henderson was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she peeled potatoes for dinner. Through the window above the sink, she could see Michael's bright red jacket as he pumped his legs back and forth on the swing, trying to go higher and higher. She smiled watching him. He was such a good kid, always staying in the yard like they taught him, never wandering off like some of the other children in the neighborhood. Robert was in the garage, tinkering with his old Ford pickup truck. The engine had been making funny noises lately, and he wanted to fix it before winter came. Every few minutes he would glance toward the backyard and wave at Michael, who would wave back with a big grin on his face. It was one of those perfect family moments that you never think will be your last. Margaret called out the back door around 4:30, telling Michael he had about 15 more minutes before he needed to come in and wash up for dinner. "Okay, Mom," he shouted back, his voice carrying that excitement that only an 8-year-old can have about getting just a little more playtime. She went back to cooking, stirring the pot of stew that was simmering on the stove, when 5 o'clock came around. Margaret called for Michael again. This time there was no answer. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the back door, expecting to see him maybe hiding behind the big oak tree or playing some game where he was pretending not to hear her, but when she looked outside, the yard was empty. The swing was still moving slightly, back and forth, like someone had just gotten off of it. "Michael," she called louder, stepping out onto the back porch. "Michael, dinner time!" The only sound that came back was the wind rustling through the trees. A strange feeling started growing in her stomach, that cold sensation you get when something just doesn't feel right. She walked around the yard, checking behind the shed, looking under the deck, even calling into the garage where Robert was still working. "Have you seen Michael?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm even though her heart was starting to beat faster. Robert looked up from under the hood of his truck, wiping grease off his hands with an old rag. "He was just on the swing a few minutes ago." "Did you check the front yard?" They both walked around to the front of the house, calling Michael's name. The neighbors across the street, an elderly couple named the Johnsons, came out when they heard the calling. "We haven't seen little Michael," Mrs. Johnson said, concern creeping into her voice. "But we'll help you look for him." Soon, more neighbors joined the search. People were checking their own backyards, looking in garages and calling Michael's name up and down the street. As the sun started to set, the worry that had been growing in Margaret's chest turned into real fear. This wasn't like Michael at all. He had never wandered off before, never disobeyed them about staying in the yard. He was the kind of kid who asked permission before doing anything, who worried about getting in trouble for the smallest things. Robert called the police at 7:30, his hands shaking as he dialed the number. "My son is missing," he said into the phone, and hearing those words out loud made it all suddenly very real. Within 20 minutes, 2 police cars were parked in front of their house, and officers were asking questions that no parent ever wants to answer. Officer Williams, a kind man with gray hair who had 3 kids of his own, sat at their kitchen table and gently asked them to describe exactly what had happened. Margaret kept glancing out the window, hoping to see Michael come running around the corner with some innocent explanation for where he had been. Maybe he had chased a ball into a neighbor's yard and gotten distracted. Maybe he had found a lost puppy and was trying to help it find its way home. But deep down, she knew something terrible had happened. Mothers have that instinct, that connection to their children that tells them when something is wrong. And everything about this felt wrong. The police search started immediately. Officers walked through every yard in the neighborhood with flashlights, checking behind every bush and under every porch. They knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen a little boy in a red jacket. They brought in dogs that sniffed around the yard and followed scent trails that led nowhere. As word spread through the community, more and more people showed up to help. Teachers from Michael's school, parents from his Little League team, even people who had never met the Henderson family but couldn't bear the thought of a child being lost and scared somewhere in the dark. By 10 o'clock at night, there were over 50 people walking through the woods behind their neighborhood, calling Michael's name and shining flashlights into every shadow. Margaret couldn't eat, couldn't sit still, couldn't do anything but pace around the house and pray. Robert stood in the backyard with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at that empty swing and trying to understand how his son could just vanish into thin air. The yard was completely fenced in. The gate was still latched. There were no signs that anyone had broken in or that there had been any kind of struggle. The hardest part was the questions that kept running through their minds. Had someone taken Michael? Had he somehow gotten out of the yard and gotten lost? Was he hurt somewhere, calling for help that no one could hear? Or worse, was he with someone who meant to harm him? These were the thoughts that parents in 1978 were just starting to have to think about. Stranger danger was becoming a real concern, and stories about missing children were starting to appear more often on the evening news. As the night wore on and the search continued with no results, the terrible reality began to set in. Their little boy, who had been laughing and swinging in their backyard just hours ago, was gone, and no one knew where he was, how he had disappeared, or if they would ever see him again. The police assured them that most missing children cases were resolved quickly, that kids usually turned up safe within a few hours. But as dawn approached and Michael still hadn't been found, everyone involved began to realize that this was going to be much more complicated than anyone had hoped. This wasn't just a little boy who had wandered too far from home. This was the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the Henderson family and their entire community for decades to come. The first year after Michael disappeared was the hardest thing Robert and Margaret had ever lived through. Every morning, Margaret would wake up for just a split second, forgetting what had happened, and then reality would crash down on her like a wave. She would lie in bed listening for the sound of little feet running down the hallway, for Michael's voice calling, "Mom, what's for breakfast?" But the house stayed silent. Robert threw himself into the search efforts with an intensity that worried everyone around him. He took time off from his job at the steel mill and spent every daylight hour putting up missing person posters, talking to police detectives, and following up on every single tip that came in. No lead was too small, no possibility too far-fetched. When someone called saying they thought they saw a boy who looked like Michael at a grocery store 2 towns over, Robert would drop everything and drive there immediately. Margaret couldn't bear to change anything in Michael's room. His dinosaur bedsheets stayed exactly as they were the morning he disappeared. His toy cars were still lined up on the windowsill where he had left them. She would go in there sometimes and just sit on his little bed, holding his favorite stuffed elephant and breathing in the faint smell of his shampoo that still clung to his pillow. The police investigation continued for months, but as time went on, the officers had other cases to work on. Detective Martinez, who had been the lead investigator, would still call the Hendersons every few weeks to check in, but there wasn't much new to report. They had interviewed everyone in the neighborhood multiple times, checked with every known registered offender in a 50-mile radius, and followed hundreds of tips from well-meaning citizens. But none of it led anywhere. The hardest part was dealing with other people. Friends and family meant well, but they didn't know what to say. Some people would cross the street to avoid having to talk to them because they felt so uncomfortable. Others would say things like, "You have to move on," or "Maybe it's time to accept that he's not coming back." These comments, though probably meant to help, felt like knives in their hearts. Margaret started attending a support group for parents of missing children that met at a church in the next town over. Sitting in that circle of folding chairs with other mothers and fathers who understood exactly what she was going through was the first time in months that she didn't feel completely alone. There was Patricia, whose teenage daughter had vanished from a shopping mall 3 years earlier. There was Tom, whose 6-year-old son had disappeared from their own backyard, just like Michael. In the support group, Margaret learned that what she was feeling was normal. The constant anxiety, the way her heart would race every time the phone rang, the inability to enjoy anything because she felt guilty for having even a moment of happiness while Michael was missing. All of it was part of the grieving process for families like theirs. Robert had a harder time opening up about his feelings. He was from a generation of men who were taught to be strong and fix problems, not talk about emotions. But the problem of finding Michael seemed impossible to fix, and that feeling of helplessness was eating away at him. He started having trouble sleeping and would often get up in the middle of the night to walk around the neighborhood, hoping against hope that he might spot something the police had missed. The second year was different, but not easier. The intense media attention faded away as newer stories took over the news cycle. People stopped asking about Michael as much, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know what else to say. Life seemed to move on around them while they remained frozen in that terrible October day when their world had turned upside down. They started getting fewer phone calls from people claiming to have seen Michael. At first, this had been a relief because most of the calls were from people who meant well but were clearly mistaken, or worse, from cruel individuals who thought it was funny to give false hope to grieving parents. But when the calls stopped coming, it felt like the world was forgetting about their son. Margaret went back to work part-time at the library where she had worked before Michael was born. Being around books and helping other people find what they were looking for gave her a sense of purpose. But she couldn't concentrate the way she used to. She would find herself staring out the window, wondering if somewhere out there Michael was looking out a window too, wondering why his parents hadn't come to find him yet. On Michael's 9th birthday, they decided to have a small ceremony. Margaret baked his favorite chocolate cake with blue frosting, just like she had done every year since he was 3. They invited close family members and lit 9 candles. Robert couldn't bring himself to sing Happy Birthday, but Margaret whispered the words through her tears. They kept doing this every year, adding 1 more candle each time, holding on to the hope that someday Michael would be there to blow them out himself. The 3rd year brought a false alarm that nearly broke them both. A boy who looked remarkably like Michael had been found living with a woman in California who claimed he was her grandson. The local police there thought it might be their missing son and called Cleveland immediately. Robert and Margaret flew out the next day, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. But when they saw the boy, they knew right away it wasn't Michael. The disappointment was crushing, but they were also grateful that the boy they met had been reunited with his real family. As the years went by, Robert and Margaret developed their own ways of coping. Margaret became involved with several organizations that helped families of missing children. She learned about new technologies that were being developed to help find missing kids, and she lobbied for changes in how police departments handled these cases. Helping other families gave her a sense that Michael's disappearance might serve some greater purpose. Even if she never got her own answers, Robert channeled his energy into home improvement projects. He renovated their kitchen, built a deck, and landscaped their entire backyard. Keeping his hands busy helped quiet his mind, and making their home more beautiful felt like a way of preparing for the day when Michael might come back. He never said this out loud, but Margaret understood. The neighborhood changed around them over the decades. Young families moved in and older residents passed away or moved to retirement homes. Children who had been Michael's age when he disappeared grew up, went to college, got married, and had children of their own. Sometimes Margaret would see these kids, now adults, and think about all the milestones she had missed with Michael. His first day of high school, learning to drive, graduation, maybe college, maybe a wedding someday, but they never gave up hope completely. Every few years, there would be a new development in forensic science, a new database of missing persons, or a new television show that featured cold cases. Each time, they would contact the authorities and ask if these new tools could help find their son. Usually, the answer was that they had already tried everything available, but sometimes there were small steps forward that kept their hope alive. Through all of this, their marriage somehow survived. Many couples in their situation didn't make it. The stress and grief were just too much. But Robert and Margaret held on to each other, understanding that they were the only two people in the world who loved Michael exactly the way they did. On the hardest days, when the weight of not knowing felt unbearable, they would remind each other that giving up on finding Michael would be like giving up on him completely. And that was something neither of them could ever do. In the spring of 2023, 45 years after that terrible October day, life on Maple Street looked very different than it had in 1978. Most of the original families had moved away or passed on, and the once quiet neighborhood now buzzed with young families in modern houses that had replaced some of the older homes. But the Henderson house remained exactly as it had always been, and Robert and Margaret, now in their 70s, still lived there with the same hope they had carried for nearly half a century, 3 houses down from the Hendersons, the old Chun house had sat empty for months. Mrs. Chun, now 87 and suffering from memory problems, had finally agreed to move into Sunset Manor, an assisted living facility across town. Her grandson David had driven in from Chicago to help sort through decades of belongings and prepare the house for sale. It was a job he had been dreading. His grandmother had been a bit of a pack rat, and the house was filled with boxes, old furniture, and countless items that seemed to have no clear purpose. David remembered spending summers at this house when he was a kid. His grandfather Harold had always been kind to him, teaching him how to fix bicycles in the garage and letting him help with gardening projects in the backyard. Harold had passed away 12 years earlier, and since then his grandmother had rarely gone down to the basement, saying it was too hard for her to navigate the stairs safely. On his 3rd day of cleaning, David decided to tackle the basement. The wooden steps creaked under his weight as he made his way down with a flashlight, since some of the light bulbs had burned out years ago. The basement was exactly what he expected, musty-smelling, filled with old holiday decorations, broken appliances, and boxes of papers that probably should have been thrown away decades ago. He worked methodically, sorting things into piles for donation, trash, and the few items that might have sentimental value. Behind the old washing machine, he found a stack of his grandfather's woodworking magazines from the 1980s. Harold had always been handy with tools and had built most of the shelving and storage areas down there himself. It was while he was moving an old workbench that David noticed something odd. The wood paneling on the far wall didn't quite line up the way it should. There was a slight gap where 2 pieces met, and when he pressed against it, the wood felt loose. Curious, he got a screwdriver from his grandfather's toolbox and started investigating. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Behind the fake wall panel was a small room, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, that had been completely hidden from view. David's hands were shaking as he shined his flashlight into the dark space. The room contained things that no one should ever have to see: children's clothing neatly folded and stored in plastic bins, dozens of photographs, and various personal items that clearly belonged to different kids. But the most disturbing discovery was a leather-bound journal sitting on a small desk in the corner. David's grandfather's name was written inside the front cover in the same careful handwriting that David remembered from birthday cards and Christmas notes. As he began to read the entries, his stomach turned and he had to sit down on the basement floor to steady himself. The journal contained detailed accounts of his grandfather's crimes, spanning several decades. Harold Chun, the man David had looked up to as a child, the man who had been respected in the community as a Sunday school teacher and volunteer, had been living a horrible double life. The entries were written in a matter-of-fact tone that made them even more chilling, describing how Harold had carefully planned and carried out acts that David couldn't even fully comprehend. One entry in particular made David's hands tremble as he read it. It was dated October 15, 1978, and it described in Harold's neat handwriting how he had convinced a neighbor boy to come into his house by telling him there was a new puppy to see. David knew immediately which neighbor boy this must be. He had heard the story of Michael Henderson's disappearance many times over the years. Everyone in the neighborhood knew about the family who had never given up hope of finding their missing son. David called the police immediately, his voice barely working as he tried to explain what he had found. Within an hour, the Chun house was surrounded by police cars and crime scene investigators. Detective Rodriguez, who now handled cold cases for the department, carefully examined the hidden room and its contents. Even though she had seen many disturbing things in her 20 years on the force, this discovery shook her. News of the discovery spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By evening, reporters and camera crews had gathered outside the Shun house, and neighbors were standing in small groups on their front lawns, talking in hushed voices about what this meant. How could they have lived next to someone who had done such terrible things? How had no one ever suspected anything? For Robert and Margaret Henderson, the phone call from Detective Rodriguez was both the answer to their prayers and their worst nightmare. After 45 years of wondering, they were finally going to learn what had happened to their son. But the detective's gentle voice on the phone told them that the news was going to be difficult to hear. When the detective arrived at their house that evening, she sat with them in the same living room where they had waited for news about Michael. All those years ago, she explained about the discovery in the Chun house, about the journal, and about what the evidence suggested had happened to their son. Margaret held Robert's hand so tightly that her knuckles went white as they listened to information that no parent should ever have to hear. The most shocking part wasn't just what had happened to Michael, but who had done it. Harold Chen had been one of the people who had helped search for Michael in those first desperate days. He had brought casseroles to their house and offered words of comfort. He had attended the candlelight vigils and helped put up missing person posters, all while knowing exactly what had happened to their son. Margaret kept shaking her head, saying, "But he seemed so nice," over and over again. Robert sat in stunned silence, remembering all the times Harold had stopped by to check on them. All the conversations they had had over the back fence about the weather or neighborhood news. The man who had destroyed their family had been living just 3 houses away, watching them grieve for the son he had taken from them. The detective explained that they would need to search the property thoroughly and that it might take time to gather all the evidence. But the journal provided specific details about where Michael's remains might be found, information that only someone who had been there could know. After 45 years of wondering if their son was still alive somewhere, if he had grown up, not knowing who he really was, if he was looking for them too, Robert and Margaret finally had their answer. As word spread through the community, people began to remember things about Harold Chen that had seemed innocent at the time, but now took on a much darker meaning. He had always been quick to volunteer for activities involving children. He had often been seen talking to kids around the neighborhood, offering to help fix their bicycles or inviting them to see something interesting in his garage. Behaviors that had seemed kindly and grandfatherly now seemed calculated and predatory. The discovery at the Chun house would eventually reveal that Michael Henderson had not been Harold's only victim. Other families in other neighborhoods would finally get answers about children who had disappeared over the years. But for Robert and Margaret, sitting in their living room on that spring evening in 2023, the only thing that mattered was that their 45-year wait for answers was finally over. They would never get Michael back, and they would never stop missing the man he should have become. But at least now they knew the truth, no matter how painful it was to hear. And for the first time in 45 years, they could begin to think about laying their son to rest. The morning after the discovery at the Chun house, Detective Rodriguez arrived, early to begin the careful process of examining all the evidence that had been hidden for decades. The journal alone contained over 200 pages of entries spanning from 1975 to 1995, written in Harold Chen's precise handwriting. Each page revealed more about the man who had fooled an entire community for so many years. As the detective read through the entries, a disturbing pattern emerged. Harold hadn't just been someone who had committed a terrible crime in a moment of madness. He had been calculating, patient, and methodical. The journal showed that he had spent months studying the routines of families in the neighborhood, noting when children played outside unsupervised, and which parents were less watchful than others. The entry about Michael Henderson was particularly heartbreaking because it revealed just how much planning had gone into that October afternoon. Harold had written about watching Michael play in his backyard for weeks, noting that the boy was always well-behaved and stayed within the boundaries his parents had set for him. He had observed that Margaret usually cooked dinner around 4:30, and that Robert worked in the garage during that time, creating a window when both parents were distracted. What made the revelation even more devastating was reading about how Harold had used his reputation as a trusted neighbor to his advantage. In the journal, he wrote about how easy it was to convince Michael to come inside by telling him he had found a lost puppy that needed help. Michael, being the kind-hearted child that he was, had immediately wanted to help the animal. The journal. Entries from the days following Michael's disappearance were perhaps the most disturbing part for everyone who read them. Harold had described in detail how he had participated in the search efforts, helping to organize volunteers and even bringing food to the Henderson family. He wrote about the performance he had to put on, acting concerned and helpful while knowing exactly what had happened to the missing boy. Detective Rodriguez had to take breaks while reading the journal because the level of deception was so overwhelming. Harold had written about standing in the Hendersons' living room, offering comfort to Margaret while she cried, all while knowing that he was the reason for her pain. He had described watching Robert put up missing person posters around the neighborhood, and feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction at seeing the family suffering. The most chilling aspect was how Harold had viewed his crimes as some kind of game. He wrote about the thrill of hiding in plain sight, of being able to fool everyone around him. He described the search parties as entertainment, writing about how amusing it was to watch people look for Michael in all the wrong places when he knew exactly where the boy was. When the police shared some of these details with Robert and Margaret, the betrayal felt almost as painful as losing Michael had been. Margaret kept saying he brought us soup over and over again, unable to understand how someone could sit at their kitchen table and eat dinner with them while carrying such a terrible secret. Robert's reaction was different. He became very quiet and spent hours just staring out the window, processing the fact that the man he had considered a friend had destroyed his family. The investigation expanded as detectives realized that Michael wasn't Harold's only victim. The journal contained references to other children from different neighborhoods across the city. Some entries mentioned kids who had been reported missing over the years, cases that had gone cold, and families who had never received answers. The scope of Harold's crimes was much larger than anyone had initially imagined. Detective Rodriguez began the difficult task of contacting other families whose children had disappeared during the time period covered in the journal. Some of these families had moved away years ago, some had divorced under the strain of losing a child, and some parents had passed away without ever knowing what had happened to their sons or daughters. Each phone call was heartbreaking, but also brought a sense of closure that these families had been waiting decades to receive. The physical evidence in the hidden room supported everything that was written in the journal. DNA testing, which hadn't been available in 1978, was now able to confirm connections between the items found in Harold's secret room and the missing children. Hair samples, pieces of clothing, and other personal belongings were matched to evidence that had been collected during the original investigations. One of the most difficult discoveries was a collection of photographs that Harold had kept as souvenirs. These weren't just pictures of the children, but also photos of their families during the search efforts, images of missing person posters, and even pictures of funeral services for victims whose bodies had been found. It became clear that Harold hadn't just committed these crimes. He had relived them over and over through these mementos. The community's reaction to these revelations was a mixture of shock, anger, and guilt. People began questioning how they had missed the signs, how they had trusted someone who had been capable of such horrible things. Neighbors remembered instances where Harold had been overly friendly with their children, times when he had offered to help with babysitting or had shown up unexpectedly when kids were playing outside. Mrs. Patterson, who had lived next door to the Chuns for 20 years, told police about how Harold had always been quick to volunteer for school events and church activities involving children. She remembered thinking it was wonderful that he was so involved with young people, never imagining that his motives were anything other than genuine care for kids in the community. The revelation also brought up painful questions about Harold's wife. The journal entries revealed that she had discovered some of his activities years earlier, but had been too frightened to report them. Harold had written about how he had convinced her that no one would believe her, and that if she said anything, he would claim she had been involved too. She had lived with this terrible knowledge for over a decade before her husband's death, and the guilt and fear had contributed to the memory problems that had led to her need for assisted care. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the journal was reading about Michael's final days. Harold had written about the boy's confusion and fear about how Michael had kept asking to go home to his parents. The entries revealed that Michael had been kept in the hidden basement room for several days, during which time the entire neighborhood was searching for him just feet above where he was being held. The journal showed that Michael had tried to escape multiple times, and that he had never stopped believing his parents would come to rescue him. Harold had written about the boy's faith in his family and his certainty that they would find him soon. Reading these entries was devastating for Robert and Margaret, but it also gave them some comfort to know that their son had never doubted their love for him, even in his final moments. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Harold Chun had been one of the most prolific predators the city had ever seen. His ability to blend into the community, to appear helpful and trustworthy, had allowed him to operate for decades without suspicion. The discovery of his secret room and journal would lead to the resolution of multiple cold cases and would finally give many families the answers they had been seeking for years. For Robert and Margaret Henderson, learning the truth about what had happened to Michael was both a relief and a new kind of torture. They finally knew what had happened to their son, but they also had to live with the knowledge that the person responsible had been someone they had trusted. Someone who had pretended to care about their suffering while being the cause of it all along. The news about Harold Chun's crimes spread far beyond the quiet neighborhood where it all began. Within days, reporters from across the country were covering the story of the trusted community member who had hidden such dark secrets for decades. But for Robert and Margaret Henderson, the media attention felt surreal. After 45 years of their son's disappearance being old news, suddenly, everyone wanted to hear their story again. The hardest part was still ahead of them. Detective Rodriguez had explained that Harold's journal contained specific information about where Michael's remains could be found, but the actual search would take time and careful planning. The Chun property had to be thoroughly examined, and specialized teams would need to be brought in to conduct the search properly. Robert couldn't sleep during the weeks that followed. Every morning he would wake up and look out his bedroom window toward the Chun house, knowing that his son had been so close all these years. The thought that Michael had been just 3 houses away while they had spent decades wondering if he was across the country, or even still alive, was almost too painful to bear. Margaret found herself walking past the Chun house multiple times. Each day she would stand on the sidewalk and try to imagine what those final days had been like for Michael. Had he heard them calling his name during those first desperate search efforts? Had he hoped they would find him? These thoughts were torture, but somehow she needed to be close to the place where her son had spent his last days. The search of the Chun property began on a gray morning in late May. Robert and Margaret weren't allowed to be present during the actual excavation, but they waited at home, holding hands and saying very little. Detective Rodriguez had promised to call them as soon as there was any news, and they jumped every time the phone rang. The call came at 3:15 in the afternoon. Detective Rodriguez's voice was gentle but confirmed what they had both been expecting and dreading. Michael's remains had been found exactly where Harold's journal had indicated, buried beneath what had once been a garden shed in the back corner of the Chun property. After 45 years of wondering, their son was finally coming home. The next few days were a blur of activity. There were legal procedures to follow, paperwork to complete, and decisions to make about funeral arrangements. But the most important thing was that they could finally lay Michael to rest properly. Margaret insisted on seeing the items that had been recovered with Michael's remains: his little red jacket, now faded and damaged by time, and a small toy car that she remembered him playing with on that last day. Word about Michael's discovery spread through their old neighborhood and beyond. People who had participated in those original search efforts 45 years ago reached out to offer their condolences. Teachers who had taught Michael in school, now retired, sent flowers and shared memories of the bright 8-year-old boy they remembered. Even people who had only heard about the case over the years felt compelled to reach out to the family. Planning Michael's funeral felt both heartbreaking and healing. Margaret chose the same church where they had held candlelight vigils during those first desperate months after his disappearance. She picked out a small white casket and arranged for flowers in blue and yellow, Michael's favorite colors. Robert, who had barely spoken since learning the truth about Harold, helped write an obituary for the son who would forever be 8 years old in their hearts. The memorial service was held on a beautiful June morning, and the turnout was overwhelming. The church was packed with people from every phase of the Henderson family's long journey. There were neighbors from Maple Street, both old and new. There were members of the support groups Margaret had attended over the years. There were police officers who had worked on Michael's case, including some who had since retired but had never forgotten about the missing boy. Detective Martinez, who had been the original lead investigator and was now in his 80s, attended the service in his old police uniform. He had never forgiven himself for not being able to solve the case when it mattered most, and being there to finally see Michael laid to rest meant everything to him. During the service, he quietly told Robert and Margaret that Michael's case had stayed with him throughout his entire career and that finally having answers brought him peace too. Margaret spoke at the service, her voice shaking but strong. She talked about the 8-year-old boy who had loved dinosaurs and baseball, who had been kind to animals and always remembered to say please and thank you. She thanked everyone who had never stopped looking for Michael, who had kept his memory alive, and who had supported their family through the hardest thing anyone should ever have to endure. But Margaret also talked about the future. During the weeks since Harold's crimes had been discovered, she had been thinking about how to turn their tragedy into something that might help other families. She announced that she was establishing the Michael Henderson Foundation, an organization dedicated to improving the way missing children cases are handled and supporting families who are going through what she and Robert had experienced. The foundation would advocate for better background checks for people who work with children, improved communication between police departments when children go missing, and faster implementation of new technologies that can help find missing kids. Margaret had learned so much over the past 45 years about the gaps in the system, and she was determined to use that knowledge to help other families get answers faster than they had. Robert's healing process was different from Margaret's. He was a man of few words, and he processed his grief privately. But in the months following Michael's burial, neighbors noticed him working in his garden more, fixing things around the house, and even smiling occasionally when he talked to the neighborhood children. For the first time in decades, he seemed to have found some peace. The discovery of Harold Chun's crimes also brought closure to other families. Over the following months, police were able to connect evidence from the hidden room to 6 other missing children cases spanning 20 years. Families who had given up hope years ago suddenly had answers. It was bittersweet. None of these families got to bring their children home alive, but they could finally stop wondering and start truly grieving, one of the most meaningful moments. For Robert and Margaret came 6 months after Michael's burial. A young woman named Jennifer approached them after a foundation fundraising event. She told them that her little brother had disappeared in 1983, and that evidence found in Harold's secret room had finally confirmed what had happened to him. She thanked them for never giving up because their persistence in keeping Michael's case alive had indirectly led to answers for her family too. The neighborhood on Maple Street slowly returned to normal, though it would never be quite the same. The Ching house was eventually sold to a young family with 2 small children. Robert and Margaret met the new neighbors and were comforted to see kids playing in that backyard again, bringing life and laughter back to a place that had held such darkness. Robert still keeps Michael's room exactly as it was, but now it feels more like a shrine than a place of desperate hope. Margaret continues her work with the foundation, traveling to speak with other families and law enforcement agencies about lessons learned from their experience. She often says that while they never got the ending they prayed for, they finally got the closure they needed to move forward. On quiet evenings, Robert and Margaret sit on their back porch and remember the good times with Michael, his laugh, his curiosity about everything, his gentle way with stray cats that wandered into their yard. The pain of losing him will never completely go away, but the agony of not knowing what happened to him finally has. After 45 years of living in limbo, they can finally grieve properly and celebrate the 8 years they had with their precious son. The story of Michael Henderson's disappearance and the eventual discovery of the truth serves as a reminder that sometimes justice comes slowly, but it can still come. And sometimes the people we trust most are the ones capable of the greatest betrayal. But it also shows the power of a community coming together, the strength of parents who never give up hope, and the importance of turning tragedy into something that can help others.